International Monetary Fund, IMF, says Nigeria's economy is recovering, but persistent structural and policy challenges continue to constrain growth to levels that cannot reduce poverty and improve health and education. Well, this is according to the latest IMF Executive Board report. The report says Nigeria's economy will grow by 2.5% over the medium term, with no growth in per capita income, if current policies fail to give way to strong reforms. The IMF advised the need for revenue-based consolidation, the shifting of expenditure mix towards priority areas, and significant increase in public investments. The fund commends Nigeria's commitment to unify its exchange rate while calling for a time-bound recapitalization plan for weak banks and phase out of Assets Management Company of Nigeria. Chief Economist with PricewaterhouseCoopers, Andrew Nevin, is in the studio with me to make more sense of IMF report. It's great to have you join us today.
Terrific to be here. Thank you.
Let's start this way. What do you make of that report? Before now, many have talked about Nigeria, other countries ignoring IMF reports, saying they don't really know what is happening deep down in our country. What do you make of some of the, before we go to the recommendations, what do you make of that report?
Well, I think the IMF has a role, and it's trying hard, but the reality is I think Nigeria already, we know what's in the report. I don't think there was anything that was particularly new or surprising to us on that, and I'm not sure that I think Nigeria could solve these issues with or without the IMF involved.
So it's commendable.
I'm not critical of the IMF, but I just think, as I said, I don't think they've said anything new, particularly in this report. These are all issues that you and I have discussed these issues on the show for the past 3 years, so I don't think the report, as I said, the IMF is constrained by its role in the, the world economic affairs, and they can't be too forward in many ways. But it didn't say anything new or surprising.
Growth of 2.5%. Does that look? He looks like a tall order to me. Can that work out with all of that we have? 1.9%, that's where we still stand.
Well, we've stood on the show and said we need to grow 6 or 8%, right? I mean, 2.5 is not good enough. I mean, the IMF report is exactly right in the sense that if we continue to grow at 2.5%, we're going to get poorer and poorer. We're not going to solve any of our unemployment or our poverty issues in the country. So that part is exactly correct. And we need a lot of things, structural changes, investment, et cetera, to do that.
He also commended Nigeria, talking about stability in the foreign exchange market. We've had that for some time now. Even the central bank continues to defend the naira. Also, confidence gradually returning to the Nigerian stock exchange. How well would you say the economy has fared between now? Many are saying that this year will be better than last year. Do you think so?
Well, I think so far only in a very marginal sense. But I mean, remember, the IMF has to write a report that has some commitment. It's like when you go for your review, your boss says, here's some good news and here's some bad news. So they have to give some good news. I mean, the reality is that the steps were taken to liberalize the FX regime were taken some time ago now. They've been very successful. But the ERGP said we were meant to move to market-based exchange rates. We haven't taken that final step. That's one of the structural issues. Certainly the fuel subsidy is one of the structural issues. Essentially, we're using money to subsidize fuel for other countries around West Africa rather than our own educational and medical needs. Obviously, another area, of course, is in the oil and gas industry where we failed to pass a PIB, so investment in it essentially has collapsed. We don't produce any more oil than we did, I think, 20 years ago in Nigeria. And of course the power sector remains one that needs restructuring. So they've identified all of those issues, but these are well known the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, the reality is we haven't really made progress. It's hard to point to any big structural issue that the federal government has taken on. Now, they've done some fantastic work, particularly people like the NIPC, the National Investment Promotion Council, and Executive Secretary Yawanda. PEBEC has done a fantastic job under the VP and the Minister of Industry, Trade and Commerce, and of course Dr. Jamoka, who runs it. So they've made efforts there on some of the issues, but they haven't tackled the big structural issues. You can't call out any one big announcement that said we're prepared to do this. And I think that's what the IMF is really stating at this point.
Let's look at some of the recommendations. We all know the volatility of the oil market. We can't predicate all our funds on it. Anything can happen. We don't control that. Now they're talking about tax reforms, additional excise, comprehensive tax, and Nigerians are running away from this. Remember what came up, talking about the VAT, wanting to increase and all of that. What do you make of some of these recommendations?
Well, I think that there are some aspects of the Nigerian economy that the IMF doesn't really take into account. To begin with, our biggest export is people. The biggest flow we have into the country is diaspora remittances, right? And it's not a big surprise. We have well-educated people that have skills that are in demand globally. They can earn a lot more outside. It's a difficult choice to leave, and many of them are going to Canada, with my home country, which is very, very cold. But they make that choice. But the net result is the biggest inflow we have are these remittances. And the biggest asset we have from an economic viewpoint right now is the diaspora, both in terms of the remittances, but also in terms of the potential to return and add to the country. So I think one thing that needs to be dealt with is what's our strategy vis-a-vis the diaspora. But it's also a stabilizing effect versus oil. So when the government says, or the IMF says 90% of our FX comes from oil, that's actually inaccurate. What's happening is that's the FX flow that the government sees. They don't necessarily see, because the diaspora flow goes to millions of Nigerians, in many cases feeding them, their health care, their education. That's not picked up, but that's the biggest flow. So that's one issue. I think a second issue that we really need to think about is the state sector is very, very small in Nigeria. I mean state in the big sense of state. We only spend 5, 6, 7% of GDP by the government, which is really almost the smallest in the world, I believe, on that. So in effect, what happens is, because the state doesn't provide services, people self-organize these services. So they organize their own infrastructure, they organize their own power, they organize their own education, they organize their own health care, oftentimes supported by this diaspora that's, you know, sending them money. So now the question is, we want to bring these self-organizing entities and people self-organizing into more formal structure, tax-paying structure. I think one thing is it's hard to see forcing that. So if someone wants to come from the informal self-organizing sector to the more formal sector involved with the government, the state, then presumably the state has to set up a structure that makes it attractive. So I'll give you a simple example, right? So I myself, and maybe I'll be deported after this, but I use an Aboki system to send money. I earn in Naira, and sometimes I need pounds, so I'll send the money to the UK with Aboki. Now, why do I do it? It's faster, it's cheaper, and as far as I can tell, it's safer than any other way of sending the money, right? So now you come and you say you want to bring this transfer into the formal remittance system. That's probably a laudable goal for many reasons, but people aren't going to switch to a formal system unless the formal system is better than that. And that's, I think, something that we really need to think deeply about, because we have had very little state education, healthcare, any other structure. There are very few state structures, and there are all these self-organized structures. So how do we make that transition? So sometimes when you have people like the IMF, and again, not a criticism, but they're kind of giving this very formulaic view of how to change things. But I don't think they're looking at the reality of how much organization is going on outside of the state sector here. So that's something to think about.
Indeed. We're going to touch on the oil and gas sector, which is very critical for growth, for development in this part of the world. That's where we get most of our revenue from. Many are talking about reforms in that sector, and it brings us to the Petroleum Industry Bill. Now, how well, we've had this for a long time and nothing has happened. What do we really expect from our oil, and can we really attract investment with the current position of Nigeria's oil and gas sector?
Well, I think obviously the oil and gas wealth belongs to Nigeria and Nigerians. So it's incumbent to have some structure that maximizes the value to them. So we're not here to give away that value to private sector actors, whether they're domestic or foreign. On the other hand, it takes a lot of investment and a lot of skill to be able to extract that value. So how do you balance off those issues? I think the point that we've been making at a broad level is NNPC often has both the role as a regulator and the role as an operator, and those roles should be separate, in fact. And then the other part is the individual NNPC entities. There's not necessarily clarity around how they're doing, how the flow of money works, et cetera. So one thing that we've said is it might help to take, not to privatize, but to take some of these entities like NLNG and partially list them. So you'd sell 20 or 30% of the shares, but it would be listed in the NSE, and we had the closing bell on the NSE. The NSE desperately needs things to be listed on it. Once it's listed, then people like PFA, ordinary Nigerians, PFA, so you're not selling it in some secret deal to a cabal. What you're doing is having an organized process so that Nigerians through their PFAs or directly can buy a piece of it. But then, of course, what happens is once it's part of the NSE, it's subject to the NSE rules, which means there needs to be transparency, audited financials. So that's the direction that we would like to see some of these assets, so that Nigeria keeps control of valuable assets, but brings more transparency, people understand the flow of funds, et cetera.
Before I let you go now, finally, we're trying to talk about the non-oil sector there, when we talk about mining, and look at what is happening in Zamfara State. That seems it's not too good for Nigeria, I tell you.
Well, I can't comment on the political situation
not political
at all.
But the economic aspect of it.
A couple of issues about mining. I know there's been a lot of talk about mining in the last few years, and we have enormous potential. But the problem with mining is that it's so capital intensive and so long term, and I don't think Nigeria is ready yet, people are ready yet to put that kind of capital in. I actually think we should be focusing more on FMCG, real estate, ICT, Nollywood, where the payback is a bit shorter, and to build confidence in it, both domestic and foreign investors, that they can invest in Nigeria and that their investments will do well. And then I think people will be prepared to put in more into mining. But to do mining on scale, you're talking about billions of dollars and 15-year paybacks. I'm just not quite sure, to be honest, that that's the right sector to focus on right now.
But a lot of resources there yet to be unearthed.
They are, but we, as I said, we're not going to attract the capital until there's more confidence in the ability to invest capital in Nigeria for that. The other issue with mining is, going back to Canada, of course, in Canada, all of the mining rights, including oil and gas actually, are owned at the provincial level. The province decides how to develop it. So in the case of Zamfara here, for example, if we had that regime, Zamfara would decide how to develop it. It wouldn't be the federal government deciding to shut down mining in Zamfara. But I said I can't make a political comment.
I know that. Andrew Nevin, Chief Economist, PricewaterhouseCoopers, thank you very much for putting insights into all of these topics. Thank you for your time.